Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are at. This is Dr. Sanchez, and I am going to review total rewards and compensation. This is one of my favorite chapters because it really is very important to our employees about their compensation and their rewards. So, the learning objectives is identifying the three general components of total rewards and giving examples of each, explain the major laws governing the employee compensation, outline strategic compensation decisions, describe the challenges of managing a global compensation system, illustrate the steps in developing a base pay system, describe how individual pay rates are set. Okay, the nature of total rewards and compensation. What is total rewards? Total rewards is monetary and non-monetary rewards that attract, retain, and motivate employees. So it can incorporate not just compensation, but benefits and so forth. Strategic decisions that guide the decision of the compensation practices, legal compliance with all the laws, that's pretty obvious, cost effectiveness for the organization, internal and external equity, optimal mix of compensation components, performance enhancements for the organization, performance recognition and talent management for employees, enhanced recruitment, involvement, and retention of employees. And we'll go over several of these. Now, this is a chart that talks about the total rewards, the typical distribution among the three types. So you've got intangible, tangible, and tangible direct. And we're going to talk about each of these. The tangible chart is terrific, and in your book, the tangible direct rewards are obviously your base pay, wages, salary, variable pay, bonus, incentives, equity awards. Indirect rewards are things like your health care benefits, your paid time off, vacation and holiday, pension, employee development and educational assistance, and then disability benefits. Those are examples of intangible awards. And then tangible indirect rewards. Intangible rewards are supportive work environment, challenging work, autonomy, positive reinforcement, things like recognition. So these are the definitions. A tangible reward is elements of a compensation that can be quantitatively measured and compared between organizations. Intangible rewards are elements of compensation that cannot be easily measured or calculated. So the nomenclature in the compensation world is base pay, basic compensation that an employee receives, usually a wage or hourly, a wage or a salary. Wages are payments calculated directly from the amount of time worked by the employee. So if somebody works 40 hours and they have $10 an hour, that's $400 of wages, where the base pay would be the $10 an hour. Salary is consistent payments made each period regardless of the number of hours worked. That's usually at the exempt level. Variable pay, compensation linked directly to individual, team, or organizational performance. And then benefits, indirect reward given to an employee or a group of employees as part of the membership of the organization. So here's some legal constraints on pay systems. And it's important to note these because these are very, very serious. We've got the Fair Labor Standards Act, the FLSA, primary federal law affecting compensation, which is enforced by the Department of Labor, wage and hour. And the three big provisions focused in this area is the minimum wage, limits on child labor, and then overtime provisions. Those three are pretty big. and as well as the overtime, which is part of that minimum wage perspective. So minimum wage is set by the Fair Labor Standards Act to be paid at a broad spectrum of covered employees. Congress action is the only way to change it, and as you know, the President has really wanted to raise the minimum wage from $7.25 to $10 or $15. Now, some states have done that, and whatever the state has is what you pay as long as it's higher. So in California, I think they passed to $15 an hour as their minimum wage. It's more than the federal wage, so they're going to pay the higher wage to their employees. Child labor provisions, the FLSA sets minimum age for employment, unlimited hours at 16. So you've got to remember, when this law passed in the 30s, children weren't going to school, they were working, and they were working 16 hours a week, some of them 12 and 13 years old, and so the FLSA really put some strict provisions around the child labor laws. And then we've got some various things covered under the child labor for hazardous occupations. The minimum is 18 years of age. Individuals that are 14 or 15 years old may work outside school hours with certain limitations. So if you've got anybody younger than 16, you've got to really watch what the law says. Areas under the FLSA is the exempt, non-exempt categories, and that's under a lot of debate. The Department of Labor and the President have said that we will get new guidance out sometime in February and March of 2015. They are changing the rules regarding exempt, non-exempt, and most HR practitioners will have to probably redo their audits on their compensation for their positions to make sure they're still meeting the exemptions. And so this will be a very big hot topic come March of 2015. Employees who are not paid overtime are exempt. Non-exempt are those who are paid overtime. Overtime, FLSA established overtime pay requirements at 1.5 times the regular rate for all hours worked in a week. Now, some states, such as California and Massachusetts, have daily overtime. Overtime over 8 hours. You've got to check your state laws as well. To comply with both is what you've got to do as HR practitioners. Now, these are the exempt statuses under the FLSA. On the left is the types of exemptions you have, and then the major criteria for exempt. So, for example, many people are under administrative. Those are where your managers are, supervisors. The pay minimum is $455 a week, paid on a salary basis, and then you've got to hit job duties, primary duties for managing, discretion and judgment, advanced knowledge and training. There is, on the Department of Labor website, guidance and webinars, and there's an HR audit sheet that I use that takes a checklist and tells you whether your position is exempt or non-exempt. And I realized that when I was doing a couple of exemptions that chefs are exempt as long as they have their certification, where cooks are not exempt, obviously. But there's a lot going on in this space. And like I said, things will come out a little bit more in March or April of 2015 with new changes. Common overtime issues. Comp time is a big issue, obviously. You really should not give comp time to hourly employees. That is an issue. Now, comp time is earned in the public sector, non-exempt, in lieu of payment of extra time, and they do that. But comp time is prohibited in the private sector and cannot be legally offered to employees working in private organizations. Incentives of non-exempt employees. This is a big audit right now. Employers must add the amount of direct work-related incentives to an employee's base pay and then calculate overtime. So if you give quarterly bonuses to your hourly employees, let's say a safety bonus, $500, and somebody's making $10 an hour, you have to go back and recalculate, add that, and recalculate their overtime. So at $10 an hour, their overtime would be about $15 an hour. But if you add the bonus for the quarterly, it could jump up to 18 hours, and then their base rate would be more too. It could be $11 or $12. And a lot of companies don't do this, and this is where the Department of Labor really hits companies on incentives for non-exempt. Training time. Time spent in training must be counted as time worked. That's by non-exempt employees. So travel time also must be counted as time worked if it occurs during normal hours. For example, flying, travel to and from work is not considered compensable time. So if you've got a non-exempt employee going to a training, you've got to pay him for that time, but the travel time there usually is paid as well. Donning and doffing. Some jobs require employees to change clothes and report to work. Regulations regarding putting on and taking off clothes have been really challenged in the courts, and now is become an issue under the FLSA. So most companies do pay for donning and doffing time. Now, here are the acts and legislations affecting compensation. You've got the pay equity laws, the Equal Pay Act, Lilly Ledbetter, and individual contractor regulations. So the Equal Pay Act is about pay discrimination on the basis of sex, and that was underlined in the Equal Pay Act of 1963. So it also prohibits companies from using different wage scales for men and women performing substantially the same jobs. Lilly Ledbetter was an interesting case, and it was the first law that President Obama signed when he became president. It reversed a Supreme Court decision changing the statute of limitations for to bring a Equal Pay Act charge. So the Equal Pay Act stated that you had to bring a charge if you felt that you were being discriminated based on pay because of sex because of pay. You had 300 days to do so. Now the Lilly Ledbetter Act says that the statute of limitations continues, that a paycheck proves that an employee continually had discrimination based on sex or race or whatever every time they got a check. So it was really a big deal for HR practitioners. We revamped compensation policies, and we really talked to our supervisors and managers about making sure that they were explaining pay and so forth and so on. Now, independent contractor, this is the #1 audit for the IRS, and that is because many organizations use 1099s, and that is a challenge because there's a growing workforce of contingent workers in many organizations, and so because you don't pay their FICA or their unemployment or workers' compensation for those contractors, the IRS is really looking at past payroll tax obligations that you might have. And so there's pretty strict rules around what is an independent contractor and what is not. And other laws affecting compensation is prevailing wage, an hourly wage determined by a formula that considers the rate of pay for a job by a majority of employers in the appropriate geographic area. Now, this prevailing wage is important when you are working for the city, state, or federal government, because most of those contracts say that you must pay prevailing wage. And so it's important for your compensation department to make sure that they go out and look for what the prevailing wage is. Garnishments, a court order that directs an employer to set aside a portion of the employee's wages to pay a debt, usually the IRS or child support. You cannot fire somebody for a garnishment, but you do have to make sure that you have, make sure you take the garnishment, but you definitely cannot terminate them for their garnishment. Now, your states have laws applying to wage garnishments as well, so you have to really look at your state. Now, this is important, and the chart is more detailed in your book, but these are the key identifying criteria for independent contractors. And the big case here was 20-something years ago was Microsoft. Microsoft, when it started the company, hired a lot of independent contractors, and they had very few employees, and they ended up suing and getting back wages and back stock and back benefits because they truly were, the courts found that they truly were employees and not contractors. So you've got behavioral control considerations. You know, if you tell a contractor when and where, a 1099, excuse me, when and where to do the work, what tools and equipment to use, what workers to hire, when to purchase supplies and services, what work must be performed by a specified individual, what order or sequence to follow, how work rules are achieved, then you've got behavioral control over that 1099. Financial, or that contractor. Financial control, extent of the worker's investment, so you got to really show the 1099 employee or the contractor has their own business. Extent to which the worker makes services available to the relevant market, that you're not the only one they're doing work for. How the business pays the worker. Usually you should pay on a project basis, not on an hourly basis. And whether or not the business reimburses travel expenses, and the extent to which the workers can realize a profit and loss. So I usually ask for profit and loss statements, their LLC or their sole proprietorship, and a list of other companies they do work for. And then the relationship, the type of relationship factors. Do you have a written contract with this person? Whether the business provides employee type benefits. How long has been the relationship with this contractor? Many contractors have been with companies for a year. The IRS would say that kind of smells like an employee. And then extent to which the services provided by the worker are key aspects of the regular business. So if your contractor is part of a regular business, core to your business, that may be an issue. So for example, I'm a human resources consultant, and I consult with restaurants. My function is not core to their business. If they had contractors who were waiters or cooks or something like that, that would be core to their business. So you've got to really watch those kinds of provisions. Then you've got the continuing compensation philosophies. And you've got two, entitlement or performance-based. Entitlement is pay and raises based on length of service, across the board raises, pay salary increases annually, industry comparisons of pay only, holiday bonuses given to all employees. Usually you see this in government entities or public entities, utilities, unionized workforces. And then you've got performance-based pay and raises based on performance, no raises for poor employees, market adjustment pay scales, no raises for length of service or job tenure, and industry comparisons of total rewards. This you'll see in private sector. Sometimes you can have a combination of both, and I have seen that in a lot of industries. All right, what are the strategic compensation decisions that you need to make? Communicating pay philosophies helps employees recognize the value of their total rewards, how their job performance might affect their compensation. We call that line of sight. Compensation responsibilities. These are pretty significant for the HR practitioner. HR specialists develop and administer the organizational compensation system. They ensure pay practices comply with legal requirements. Line managers evaluate employee performance and participate in pay decisions. That means they need to be trained on how you're doing it. Payroll Administration, you've got to assure compliance with laws to maintain positive employee relations. Most payroll staffs report to the HR function or the accounting function, and there's liability for legal compliance remains with the company. So your compensation department really is constantly doing analysis to make sure you're not having disparate impact treatment on a particular class, or that you have gender issues with pay. Those types of things are what your compensation department does on a regular basis. So your responsibility is still the company's, even if your payroll is outsourced. This chart is in your book, and it's terrific. It's a great metrics for compensation. I particularly like the one that is the productivity. That's total revenue divided by the number of full-time equivalents. That gives your CFO a good idea of what every employee is contributing to the bottom line. And then comp ratio. Those are comp ratios of your employees, and it's basically their salaries divided by a midpoint. And so you can find out what the average comp ratio is. If it's a 1, it's going to be at your midpoint. If it's over 1, that's a little bit higher than midpoint, and if it's under 1, it is under the midpoint. All right, let's get into motivation theories of compensation. And we take these into consideration because we really decide kind of what motivates employees. I mean, research in the field of worker motivation has been since the 60s, and there's been really 2 theories of motivation. The expectancy theory is the first. Employees' motivation is based on the probability that their efforts will lead to an expected level of performance that is linked to the value of the rewards. So if we pay our employees, we expect them to work more or perform better. The components of the expectancy theory, and it was developed by Victor Vroom. You probably have studied Vroom in some other classes, but he states that there's important relationships within the expectancy theory. Again, perceived likelihood that if the employee invests time in learning new product features, it will lead to better sales performance. These are examples. So that's an expectancy. Instrumentality is perceived likelihood that better sales performance will lead to higher commission pay. And then valence is employee places a high value on receiving that commission pay. So that's the components of the expectancy theory. The other theory is the equity theory. Individuals judge fairness in compensation by comparing their inputs and outcomes against the inputs and outcomes of reverent others. And I'm sure many of you out there have employees that compare themselves to others, reverent others, or workers that the individual uses as a reference point to make these comparisons. So you'll have somebody say, well, Susie Q over there doesn't work as hard as I am, and she's making more money than I do. So that's what they're talking about under this theory. And the important thing is that individuals may not always believe that they are being rewarded fairly as opposed to their peers. So you've got their input and outcomes, and then their reverent others' input and outcomes. So this is a great little chart that is in your book. It gives you a little bit more detail. It was interesting that an HR Solutions International study found that employees often think peers at other firms earn more than they do, but in reality they are usually paid at the same rate. All right, now, compensation, fairness, and equity. You've got three elements of this fairness and equity: external equity, internal equity, pay secrecy versus openness. Let's talk about external equity. If an employer's rewards are not viewed as equitable compared to other organizations, the employer is likely to experience maybe high turnover. So that's why it's really important that you put your benchmarks out. You know, at Southwest Airlines, they benchmark other airlines. So they're benchmarking the equity of pay and benefits for American Airlines, United, anybody else that they feel comparative. Every industry does it. But it's important that your employees know who you're benchmarking with externally, because they'll go to payscale.com and pop in their job, and that is not going to give them true external equity, because it is every industry, every person can put anything in there. It's not really validated information. At times, PayScale does have some good validation in others. Then there's internal equity, and that is procedural justice and distributive justice. So, internal equity means the employees are compensated fairly with regard to their knowledge, skills, and abilities they use in their job, as well as their responsibilities, accomplishments, and job performance. Employees continually assess their effort-reward ratio in comparison to co-workers. And they do that in two ways. Procedural justice is perceived fairness of the process and procedures used in making decisions about employees, including their pay. That's why it's important that you really educate your managers around the procedures of how to give employees pay increases. You want to make sure that the decision-making process is fair. And then distributive justice, the perceived fairness in how rewards are distributed. For example, if a hardworking employee whose performance is outstanding receives the same across-the-board raise as an employee with attendance problems and mediocre performance, then inequity may be perceived. So those are the two as it relates to internal equity. Then you have pay secrecy versus openness. And this has been really tested by the National Labor Relations Act. Many employees who have been discussing their pay on Facebook and have been fired, or discussing pay at work and have been fired, the National Labor Relations Act says that it's protected activity under their Section 7 rights, which they can discuss pay, terms of condition of employment, management, and so forth, as long as it's considered protected activity, which means one other person is involved in it. So those old policies of you cannot discuss your pay have been challenged, and employers have lost. So you may want to go back into your handbooks and take those out, because those are really employees' rights to, and the courts have found that those employees have a right to discuss their pay and benefit issues. All right, now compensation quartile strategies. This is the strategy you're going to have in your compensation, and you can also have it in your benefits. So are you going to lead the market, match the market, or lag the market? And you can do both. You can have different kind of strategies for benefits. So if you say you're going to lead the market in compensation, you may want to lag the market in benefits, because the total rewards package would be 100%. Or you can have a match-match strategy that you're going to match the market for benefits and compensation. So it's a strategy that your company decides they do. And then this really should be communicated to your employees, because they'll understand, okay, my pay is 50% of the market, and so 50% of the firms pay above and 50% of the firms pay below. And these are the definitions. Lag the market is used when the employer is experiencing financial difficulties and when an abundance of workers is available. Lead the market is an aggressive approach that enables a company to attract and retain sufficient workers with the required capabilities and being more selective when hiring. And then match attempts to balance the employer cost pressures and the need to attract and retain employees by providing compensation levels that meet the market for the employer's job. So it's important that your employees know what strategy you're using and why, because they're going to look to their pay and start comparing themselves to others outside the market, equity, and then internally as well. All right, so selecting a quartile. Deciding which quartile position to target for pay structure is a function of many considerations. Your financial resources, your competitive pressures, the market availability of employees with different capabilities, and then decisions about compensation mix and competitive position should be addressed as part of the compensation total rewards strategy. Now, the other way is compensation-based pay. And that is rewarding individuals for capabilities they demonstrate and acquire. So employees receive more for doing jobs that require a greater variety of tasks, more knowledge, skills, greater physical effort, so forth and so on. In knowledge-based pay or skill-based pay, it is really based on what they know, and it starts at the base pay level of pay. Starts at a base pay level of pay. Receives increases as they learn to do other jobs and gain additional skills. So, for example, a manufacturing firm operates plastic molding presses of various sizes. Operating larger presses requires more skills than smaller presses. Under the KBP or SBP system, press operators increase their pay as they learn how to operate the more complex pressers, even though sometimes they may be running only smaller positions. So, bottom line is they become more valuable to the employer. All right, then compensation design issues. Are you going to have individual versus team? And some companies do a mix of both. Individual is how to compensate individuals whose performance may be as a result of team efforts and achievement, and then how to develop compensation programs that support the team concept. Again, it goes back to your strategic plan. Are you a team-based culture or are you an individual-based culture? Those kinds of things need to be considered when you're developing these kinds of compensation systems. Now, this is a great chart as it relates to multinational enterprises, globally, companies that do work globally. And on the left is the type of international assignments. An expatriate is an employee, and here's an example. An employee is a U.S. citizen working at a U.S. company who is sent to China on assignment. That's an expat. A local hire, a host country national local hire, an example is an employee is a citizen of China working for a U.S. company at its operation in China. And then a third country national, an example is an employee is a citizen of India working for a U.S. company at its operation in China. So you can tell that it can be very complex compensation category, but it works. It works for multinational companies, and it's more and more becoming the norm. So, compensating expatriates, you want to have home country-based approaches to maintain the expatriate standard of living in the home country. Host country-based approach, compensate the expat at the same level as workers from the host company. And your book gives you a little bit more detail around it. Now, let's talk about compensation administration. This is a great chart. Talks about the way you get from a compensation philosophy down to the actual grades and pay and all of that. The job evaluation, everything really starts with the job evaluation once you have a strategy. The job evaluation is a formal systemic means used to identify the relative worth of jobs within the organization. You can do a compensable factor, job value commonly present throughout the group of jobs within an organization. And it's derived by the job analysis, reflects the nature of the different jobs. So, first of all, you create the job analysis. And that job analysis is usually 15 to 20 page paper about the details of the job, and then a job evaluation is completed from that job analysis. And that gives the compensation specialist a lot of information about the different types of work performed in your company. Now there's four types of job evaluation methods, and this is more internally focused, but the ranking method is a simple system that places jobs in order from highest to lowest by their value in the organization. That's usually done at smaller organizations. The classification method is used primarily in the public sector. Descriptions of job classes are written, and then each job is put into a grade according to their best match. The factor comparison is a complex quantitative method that combines the ranking and point factor methods. And then there's the point factors. And the point factor method is really used widely as a job evaluation method. And it basically gives points to different dimensions of the job. For example, how many people do you have, are you responsible for, what's your budget, and it's pretty quantitative. Then you have market pricing, and this is becoming more and more popular, obviously, and more companies are moving to a market-based pricing, especially global organizations, because the market is different in different countries, just as it is in the United States. So you use the market pay data to identify the relative value of the jobs based on what other employers pay for a similar job. You identify relevant market pay data for jobs that are good matches. The jobs, the geographic decisions, or considerations, company strategies and philosophies about the desired market competitiveness. So here's the advantages and disadvantages of job evaluation methods. It ties organizational pay levels to the external job market without internal job evaluation distortion. So that's an advantage. It communicates to employees that compensation system is linked to the market. The disadvantages are that you have to rely on market survey data, and sometimes that's not timely. Specific job may differ from a matching job in the survey. So for example, many market surveys have engineering 1 through 6, And what the comp specialist really has to do is find the match. And you may have a hybrid between, let's say, engineer 2 and 3. So it is really tough to really make a match on some of those survey data. And the market data scope may be a concern. It depends on the level, who's the market, you know, do they have the same amount of employees as you have? Do they have the same amount of gross sales as you do? And then tying pay levels to the market data can lead to wide fluctuations. Again, it is something that your compensation people have to constantly be on top of. Now, pay surveys are a collection of data on compensation rates for workers performing similar jobs in organizations. And usually, benchmark jobs are jobs found in many organizations that can be used for purposes of comparison. So I use the engineering position, engineer 1 through engineer 6. Our benchmark job may be engineer 3. And engineer 3 is in all the pay surveys, and it matches our job. That would be a benchmark job. So, you know, just depends on what you're considering to be a benchmark job. But the pay surveys, you also have to see if it's in your industry. Is it a good match for your industry? So a lot of factors go in determining what pay surveys you use. Internet-based pay surveys, you know, those are really, really good. There's salary.com, there's glassdoor.com, but you've got to be cautious about the accuracy, their validity, and reliability. You know, sometimes online may not be correct because employees can respond to salary.com and not HR practitioners who really know the nuts and bolts of your pay. So I think pay surveys are really more reliable. And you're really looking for survey data relevance and validity. You want to make sure that you've got job matches, as we talked about. Their methodology is established, that they include data from different employers in different industries, and that it's a realistic sample of employers, that they give you detailed about the job. So there's a lot of factors that go in deciding what pay surveys you can use. Now, some of the legal issues. Conditions to be met by the organization that participate in surveys. It must be administered by a third party. Data must be more than 3 months old. Minimum of 5 employers must participate in a survey, and no single employer's data may be worth more than 25% of the total. So these are kind of the provisions of participating in a salary survey. And then your book talks about price fixing and so forth. You need to read about all that. Really, care must be taken to avoid violating the National Labor Relations Act provisions in disclosing wage and benefit information. All right, pay grades. So these are groupings of individual jobs having approximately the same job worth. The market line is the graph that shows the relationship between the job value as determined by job evaluations and pay survey. And then you've got market banding, grouping jobs into pay grades based on similar market survey amounts. Let me give you an example. Your book gives a good example. Here's pay ranges. Each pay range, pay grade, pay level can be determined by making the market line and the midpoint of the new structure. practice of using fewer pay grades, broad banding, is much broader pay ranges than in traditional compensation systems. Okay, so when we're dealing with pay ranges, companies have used a combination of job evaluation points and then market. And so based on that, they come up with their pay ranges. Broad banding, the main advantage of broad banding is that it's more consistent with flatter organizations and the more growing use of multidimensional jobs. The hard part is that employees, expect promotions, and in a broad banding kind of scenario, there may not be that opportunity. This is what I'm talking about, and this is a regression equation that we do. It's based on the job evaluation points and then the market pay line. And your compensation people are very skilled at doing all of this, which can really be quite analytical to do. So, but this gives you a great example of what that looks like. Now, red circled employees, green circled employees, pay compression. All right, red circled employees, you guys probably know this. It's when a current job holder who is paid above the range is set for the job. So somebody is making over the pay range. Many red circled employees won't get an increase, they'll get a lump sum. Same with green circle. That means that somebody's paid below the range. And so you're making steps to bring them up into the minimum. Pay compression is a situation which pay differences among individuals with different levels of experience and performance in the organization becomes small. So pay compression really happens when the market is hot and it's hard to find individuals. So for right now, nursing is big. We can't find enough nurses. And so we're bringing nurses out of school into our midpoints. Well, many of the nurses that have been here for 3 to 5 years in a company may be at the midpoint, but we're bringing out of school nurses to the midpoint. Therefore, they have different levels of experience and performance, and we're bringing them into that midpoint, which is closely related to our nurses that have skilled and experience. That's called compression. When you are really mixing the two and bringing individuals with less experience and less performance, or your performance is unknown, and you're bringing them to the midpoint or the market of what your pay structure is. Approaches to provide employees with performance-based incentives. You targeting higher performers, focusing on providing the top performing employees with higher raises. Pay adjustment matrix reflects an employee's upward movement in an organization or a firm. And these are the factors you consider: employee's level of performance as rated in the appraisal, employee's position. Okay, so I'm going to jump to this chart for a minute. It's the pay adjustment matrix. And many employees don't understand this. If you have a pay-for-performance organization and you've got employees that are meeting expectations, if you look on the left, if they're in the first quartile, okay, that means they're at the lower end of their band or their range. They're going to get 3 to 5% merit increase or a pay adjustment, as opposed to me, where I'm in the third quartile and I'm still meeting expectations. I'm going to get 0 to 2%. So employees don't understand why Susie Q is getting 5% with the same performance and Diane is getting 2% with the same performance. And it's based on where you are in your range, your comp ratio. And this is very hard concept for employees and managers to explain. The bottom line is that the whole function of compensation is, as you are performing and gaining your skills, you're getting more and more compensation to get you to the midpoint, because then you're fully competent in your job. And then as you go over the midpoint, those increases become smaller because we don't want you to go over the range. It's a hard concept to swallow. A lot of people don't understand it, and a lot of people don't agree with it. And so this is important for HR practitioners and managers to really explain to their employees. But it is a terrific chart that gives you a great concept of what I just talked about. Now let me go back to this. Standard increases, those are seniority-based, cost of living across the board, and lump sums. And your book gives some great details about those. Now, what are our challenges? Our challenges are obviously economic recession. Many layoffs and reductions. Employees took huge pay cuts after the 9/11 experience, at least in the airline industry. And so they're finally getting their compensation back to where it was back pre-recession. Then you have the two-tier wage system. And as a global competition has increased, lower skilled jobs have been sent offshore. So some companies have, been saddled with high wage costs from decades of generous pay. And so you're really trying to, how would you say it, not minimize, but really meet the market as it is now. So some of your wages and people that were in hot markets like IT may have higher wages than, pre-Y2K than they do now. And so their wages would be less coming into the job. That's what two-tier is. And then gender pay. Gender pay is just gaps in females and males. And we, ladies, we still are estimated to be paid at 73 cents on the dollar, sometimes 75 cents, they're saying. But again, it is constantly something that we need to review. So thank you for attending this webcast. I hope you found this helpful. And as always, please have any of your questions, send them by email. Thank you for attending.